Most individuals envision the era of Jesus as a spiritual environment. Footwear, teachings, wonders, morality narratives in a distant religious history. However, for the individuals actually existing there, daily existence was not established by theology. It was established by currency, or more accurately, by the absence of it. The reality where the historical individual of Jesus was born was influenced by one of the most unequal economic frameworks the ancient Mediterranean had ever observed. Welcome to the Financial Historian, one where currency, authority, and history intersect, and nothing exists as straightforward as it appears. At the commencement of the 1st century, Judea resided inside the Roman Empire, the most sophisticated extraction apparatus the planet had observed. Rome didn't conquer regions to integrate them. It conquered them to fund the center. Provinces existed to relocate prosperity outward. Grain, silver, labor flowing from the boundaries of the empire toward Rome itself. Judea was one of those boundaries. This mattered because Judea was not prosperous. It was largely rural, agricultural, and vulnerable. Most individuals lived off the territory, not farms in the contemporary understanding. Plots merely adequate enough to survive. A poor harvest didn't signify reduced profits. It signified hunger, and Rome didn't care. Rome governed Judea through a combination of local elites and imperial representatives. Monarchs like Herod the Great ruled with Roman authorization. After his death, Roman prefects, like Pontius Pilate, supervised the region. Their responsibility wasn't to enhance living conditions. It was to maintain order and guarantee revenue kept flowing. Taxes were the framework's foundation, and this is where things become uncomfortable. Individuals currently consider taxes as something compensated on earnings, profit, expansion. In Judea, taxes were owed regardless of result. You compensated because you existed. Territory tax, produce tax, head tax, toll taxes on roads and markets, religious taxes layered on top of imperial ones. Miss a compensation and the consequences were immediate. There was zero IRS. There was zero appeals procedure. Tax collection was outsourced to local contractors, tax farmers who compensated Rome upfront for the privilege to collect and then pressure the population to recover their expenses and generate a profit. Exploitation wasn't a defect, it was the motivation. If you couldn't compensate, you borrowed. Obligation was everywhere, and unlike contemporary obligation, it had zero safety mechanisms, zero bankruptcy, zero restructuring. Interest accumulated rapidly. Territory was collateral. One poor year could push a household into a spiral they would never escape. Here's how it typically operated. A farmer plants crops. Weather transforms. Harvest fails. Taxes are still due. The farmer borrows from a local lender, often a prosperous territory owner or temple-connected elite. Interest compounds. Next year, yields barely recover. Obligation remains. Eventually, the territory is seized. The farmer becomes a tenant on what used to be his own property, or worse, a laborer, or disappears entirely. This wasn't an accident. It was structural. Over period, territory consolidated into fewer hands. Large properties replaced modest plots. Prosperity clustered around elites tied to Roman power and temple administration. The majorities sank into precarity. The economy didn't merely produce poverty, it reproduced it. And there was zero state safety net. If you lost your territory, there was zero unemployment assistance, zero welfare, zero public housing. Households were the only buffer. Community charity existed, but it was restricted. When too many individuals fell simultaneously, the framework offered nothing. Obligation wasn't merely financial, it was social. Losing territory signified losing position, losing security, losing identity. Your household's future could be eliminated by a drought, a tax increase, or a single unpaid responsibility. This is the reality Jesus was born into, and it's important to state this clearly. Most individuals were not impoverished because they were lazy, immoral, or cursed. They were impoverished because the framework required them to be. Rome needed surplus. Local elites needed rents. The temple needed income. All of that pressure sat on individuals with the least margin for error. This produced something else as well. Tension. Judea was not quiet. It was volatile. Rebellions flared constantly. Banditry wasn't merely crime. It was economic desperation. Groups formed promising relief, justice, reversal. Messianic movements didn't emerge in comfort. They emerged in collapse. And this is where contemporary viewers often miss the point. When individuals listen to teachings about obligation, forgiveness, release, justice, and reversal, they weren't hearing metaphors. They were hearing economic survival. When they heard talk of the impoverished, it wasn't abstract compassion. It was their neighbors, their households, themselves. Terms like forgiveness in this context didn't merely signify emotional relief. They signified obligation cancellation, reset, escape. And escape was rare. The Roman framework was designed to be efficient, not humane. It extracted prosperity upward with remarkable consistency. It tolerated suffering as long as order was maintained. Stability mattered more than fairness. Revenue mattered more than lives. This is why Judea felt suffocating. Individuals worked harder and fell further behind. Productivity didn't translate into security. Expansion didn't lift all vessels. It lifted a few and sank the rest. The economy functioned, but it didn't heal. And importantly, everyone understood it. There was zero illusion that the framework was fair. There was zero conviction that hard work guaranteed safety. There was only endurance and resentment and hope that something, anything, might break break the cycle. That hope is where concepts become dangerous. Because when a framework is this tight, even modest modifications feel revolutionary. Even terms can destabilize it, especially terms. By the period Jesus begins speaking publicly, the economic pressure is already unbearable. The audience is primed. The fractures are visible. The anger is genuine. The desperation is rational. This is not a backdrop. This is the engine. To comprehend why the economy of Judea felt so inescapable, you have to examine the institution everyone believed was supposed to safeguard them: the temple. Most individuals currently imagine the temple in Jerusalem as purely religious, a location of prayer, sacrifice, and spiritual power. But in economic terminology, the temple was one of the most powerful financial institutions in the region. It didn't merely influence conviction, it relocated currency, substantial currency. The temple sat at the center of a layered framework. On one level, it was sacred. It was where individuals believed God's presence resided. On another level, it operated as a treasury, a financial institution, a tax power, and a court. And these functions were inseparable. Every adult Jewish male was required to compensate a yearly temple tax. This wasn't optional. It wasn't symbolic. It was enforced. The tax was compensated in a specific silver coin, the Tyrian shekel, because it had a consistent silver content. Local currencies weren't accepted. Roman coins weren't accepted. That signified individuals had to exchange currency to compensate their religious responsibility. Currency changers handled this. They didn't execute it for free. Exchange fees were built into the framework. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem for festivals needed to convert their currency. Vendors sold animals for sacrifice: doves, lambs, cattle at temple authorized prices. If you were impoverished, you didn't escape the framework. You compensated in smaller offerings, but you still compensated. Religion wasn't replacing the Roman tax burden. It was stacked on top of it. And here's the crucial tension. The temple elite were deeply intertwined with Roman power. High priests weren't selected by popular support or spiritual merit. They were appointed with Roman authorization. Stability mattered more than righteousness. Cooperation mattered more than justice. So the institution that claimed moral power over the individuals also benefited from the same extraction reasoning that impoverished them. This created a quiet contradiction. The temple preached holiness, forgiveness, and righteousness, but its operations reinforced obligation, inequality, and exclusion. Access to God required compensation. Purity required offerings. Forgiveness required sacrifice. And sacrifice required currency. If you had none, you relied on charity. But charity was inconsistent. It couldn't absorb systemic pressure. It couldn't undo territory loss. It couldn't cancel obligations. It treated symptoms, not causes. And individuals noticed. By the 1st century, resentment toward temple authorities was widespread. Not because individuals rejected conviction, but because they observed hypocrisy. The institution meant to mediate between God and the individuals looked increasingly like another arm of elite control. This matters because Jesus didn't operate outside this framework. He spoke directly into it. When he talked about obligation forgiveness, individuals comprehended it economically. When he talked about release, they heard relief. When he talked about the impoverished, they didn't imagine distant charity cases. They imagined themselves. And when he talked about the kingdom of God, they didn't hear abstraction. They heard an alternative order, one where the current framework wasn't final. That's why his terms carried weight. But terms alone don't threaten authority structures. Behavior does. Jesus didn't attack Rome directly. That would have terminated quickly. Instead, he undermined legitimacy. He reframed worth. He challenged who deserved power and why. He spoke in manners that weakened the moral foundation of both Roman extraction and temple complicity. This is why economic language appears everywhere in the teachings. Obligation, wages, laborers, vineyards, creditors, stewards, masters, servants. These weren't metaphors selected at random. They reflected daily existence. They made inequality visible. And then there was the act that transformed everything: the disruption in the temple. When Jesus overturned the tables of the currency changers, it wasn't merely religious outrage. It was economic confrontation. He wasn't attacking prayer. He was attacking the machinery that monetized access to the sacred. He called it a den of robbers, not because currency existed, but because extraction had replaced justice. This crossed a line. Rome tolerated prophets. It tolerated teachers. It even tolerated critics. What it didn't tolerate was instability. And temple authorities understood that unrest near Passover, when Jerusalem filled with pilgrims, was dangerous. Crowds plus grievance equaled rebellion. From their perspective, Jesus wasn't merely preaching. He was disrupting flows. He was challenging legitimacy. He was destabilizing the balance that kept them in authority and kept Rome satisfied. And that's the crucial point. The conflict wasn't primarily theological. It was economic and political. The framework could tolerate suffering. It could tolerate inequality. What it couldn't tolerate was a narrative that made individuals question why the suffering existed and whether it was necessary. Because once individuals cease accepting obligation as destiny, extraction becomes harder to enforce. By this point, Judea was a pressure cooker. Taxes, territory loss, obligation, religious responsibility, and political repression all converged. Revolt was not a question of if but when, and Rome responded to pressure the same manner it always did. What followed after Jesus wasn't the collapse of the framework. It was the escalation of it. it. With framework, it was the escalation of it. Within a generation, Judea erupted into full-scale revolt. In the year 66, open rebellion against Rome broke out. By 70, Jerusalem was under siege. The temple, the economic, religious, and political center of Jewish existence, was destroyed stone by stone. Its treasury was looted. Its priestly hierarchy erased. Hundreds of thousands were killed or displaced. Rome didn't merely suppress dissent. It dismantled the infrastructure that made resistance possible, and then it rebuilt control on its own conditions. This is the component individuals often miss. The destruction of the temple didn't terminate economic extraction. It streamlined it. Roman taxation intensified. Territory consolidation accelerated. Obligation didn't disappear. It became less visible, more bureaucratic, more absolute. The old moral language collapsed, but the material pressure remained. In the short term, Rome won decisively, violently, and efficiently. But winning control of region is not the same as winning control of meaning. Jesus had not been leading a force. He hadn't promised a new tax strategy or redistribution of territory. He wasn't attempting to replace Roman administration with a rival state. And that is precisely why his impact can't be measured by regime modification. What he challenged wasn't Rome's ability to extract. It was the moral reasoning that made extraction feel inevitable, deserved, and divinely sanctioned. By undermining the concept that obligation reflected moral failure, by offering forgiveness outside institutional compensation, by treating the impoverished as central rather than defective, Jesus destabilized something Rome depended on just as much as legions: legitimacy. Empires can survive suffering. They struggle when individuals cease believing suffering is the price of order. After the temple fell, the framework Jesus critiqued did not vanish, but neither did his critique. In the decades that followed, modest communities formed that operated on different assumptions: shared resources, mutual aid, obligation relief within the group, loyalty based on conviction rather than territory, bloodline, or position. These weren't revolutions. They were parallel reasonings, manners of existing inside the empire without fully belonging to its moral economy. Rome crushed armed rebellion rapidly. It always did. But this kind of challenge was harder to extinguish because it didn't require region, temples, or treasuries. It relocated with individuals. It operated under pressure. It survived loss. And over period, something unexpected occurred. Rome never fully recovered control of the narrative individuals told themselves about authority, obligation, and legitimacy. By the 4th century, the empire didn't eliminate this alternative moral framework. It absorbed it. In executing so, it quietly conceded something profound. Power could no longer rest on force alone. Moral credibility mattered, even to authority. The economy of Jesus' period shows us something uncomfortable. Frameworks don't collapse merely because they are unjust. They collapse when the narratives that justify them cease operating. Rome optimized extraction, but it never fully repaired the moral breach that made its dominance feel natural, and that's the deeper instruction. Economic frameworks wrapped in moral language are extraordinarily durable. They survive hardship. They survive resentment. They even survive rebellion. What they don't survive is widespread disbelief. The moment when individuals cease accepting that suffering is necessary, deserved, or meaningful. History doesn't replicate, but it does expose patterns. And once you observe how authority defends itself not merely with force but with narratives, it becomes substantially harder to believe those narratives are accidental. If this provided you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History possesses the answers. I'll demonstrate you where to look.